The great halls of the Concorde station stretched for miles in every direction. And within those halls sat representatives from over 3,000 species who had mastered the stars, long before humanity had learned to make fire. These ancient beings had watched countless civilizations rise and fall, and they had developed systems to measure the worth of every new species that crawled its way into the galactic community. High Arbiter Velthrix stood at the center of the Grand Chamber, his forearms folded behind his back as holographic displays showed images of the strange new species called humans. His scaled face showed no emotion, but his mind was filled with concern as he studied these soft-skinned creatures from the distant world called Earth. "They are dangerous," spoke Ambassador Krillvex, her insectoid body clicking with each word, "and we cannot ignore what they have accomplished in such a short time." The chamber murmured in agreement. Humanity had burst onto the galactic scene only 50 years ago, and in that brief moment they had expanded across 12 star systems. They built warships that moved faster than anyone expected, and they fought with a ferocity that made even the warrior clans of the Dominion pause. "They come from a death world," Velthrix reminded the assembly, and his voice echoed through the massive chamber. "A planet where the gravity crushes bones and the atmosphere burns lungs. Where predators hunt in every shadow and the weather itself tries to kill all living things." The representative shuddered at the thought. Most civilized species came from gentle worlds with stable climates and peaceful ecosystems. The idea of evolving on a planet that actively tried to murder its inhabitants was terrifying beyond measure. "We must test them," declared Councillor Namthur, an ancient being of pure energy who had existed for 10,000 years, "as we have tested all who came before, and we must see what they truly are." The Crucible trials were the oldest tradition in galactic society. Every species underwent these tests when they first joined the community of stars, and the results determined their place in the hierarchy of civilizations. The trials measured strength and endurance and intelligence and pain tolerance, and they revealed the true nature of any species. But Velthrix had a different idea, and he raised his primary arms to silence the chamber. "We will test them," he announced, "but we will not test their champions or their heroes or their finest warriors, because any species can produce exceptional individuals who surpass the norm." The assembly leaned forward with interest as the High Arbiter continued. "We will demand that humanity send their weakest soldier," Velthrix declared, "the lowest and least impressive member of their military forces, because the true measure of a species is not found in their greatest, but in their least." The chamber erupted in approval. This was brilliant strategy. If humanity's worst soldier performed poorly, it would prove that humans were nothing special. If their weakest failed spectacularly, the galaxy would have nothing to fear. The formal request was transmitted to Earth within the hour, and it arrived at the headquarters of the United Military Command, just as the sun was setting over the mountains of Colorado. General Sarah Chun read the message 3 times before she started laughing so hard that her aides thought she had lost her mind. "They want our weakest soldier," she said to her staff, and tears of amusement rolled down her cheeks. "They actually think they understand what that means." The search took 2 weeks, and military databases were scoured across every base and installation on 12 worlds. They needed someone who met the minimum requirements for active service and not a single point more. Someone unremarkable in every possible way. They found Marcus Cole at a supply depot in Wyoming, where he spent his days counting boxes and filing inventory reports. He was 34 years old with thinning brown hair and a slight belly that pushed against his uniform. His fitness scores sat exactly at the minimum acceptable level, and he had flat feet and mild asthma and had never once seen combat. Marcus was eating a sandwich in the break room when 2 officers in formal dress, uniforms appeared and told him he had been selected for a special assignment. "There must be some mistake," Marcus said with his mouth still full of turkey and cheese, "because I'm literally the least qualified person on this entire base." "That is exactly why you were chosen," replied the colonel, and her expression gave nothing away. Marcus Cole spent the next 3 days being briefed on galactic politics and alien species and the nature of the trials he would face. He sat in conference rooms surrounded by generals and admirals and diplomats, who explained that the fate of humanity's reputation rested on his shoulders. "No pressure, though," said one scientist with a nervous laugh that did nothing to calm anyone. The night before his departure, Marcus called his mother and told her he was going on a business trip and would be back in a few weeks. He did not mention that he would be traveling to a space station, orbiting a dying star to be tested by aliens who wanted to prove that humanity was weak. The transport ship carried him beyond Earth's orbit and through a series of jump gates that bent space in ways that made his stomach turn. Marcus spent most of the journey trying not to vomit while reading a small handbook about the species he would encounter. When the Crucible station finally appeared on the view screen, Marcus felt his heart drop into his boots. The station was enormous beyond anything he had imagined, a ring of metal and crystal that could have held 100 cities. Ships from 1,000 worlds docked along its edges, and lights blinked across its surface like stars brought down from the sky. "Welcome to your trial, human," crackled a voice over the communication system, and Marcus thought he detected amusement in the alien tones. He gathered his small duffel bag and walked toward the airlock, where a delegation of strange beings waited to receive him. Marcus took a deep breath, coughed slightly because of his asthma, and stepped forward to meet his destiny. Across the galaxy, billions of eyes turned to watch. Betting pools opened on 10,000 worlds, and most wagers predicted the human would collapse within minutes. The average estimate gave him 4 minutes before complete failure. None of them understood what they were about to witness, and none of them knew that humanity's minimum standards had been forged on a death world where survival was never guaranteed. They saw a soft and unremarkable creature with flat feet and breathing problems, and they assumed he would break like glass. They were about to learn how wrong they were, and the lesson would terrify them for generations to come. Marcus Cole stepped through the airlock and immediately felt the weight of 1,000 stairs pressing down upon him. The receiving chamber was massive beyond anything he had ever seen, with ceilings that stretched so high they disappeared into shadow, and walls covered with screens that displayed his face to watching audiences across the stars. High Arbiter Velthrix stood at the front of the alien delegation, and Marcus had to crane his neck to look up at the towering creature. The Arbiter was nearly 9 feet tall with scales that shimmered between blue and green, and his forearms were folded in what Marcus assumed was a gesture of superiority. "You are the one they sent?" Velthrix asked through a translation device, and his mandibles clicked with barely hidden contempt. "You are humanity's weakest soldier?" Marcus looked down at his own unremarkable body and then back up at the alien giant. "That is what they tell me," he replied, and his voice echoed strangely in the vast chamber, though I prefer to think of myself as humanity's most adequate supply clerk. The aliens exchanged glances that Marcus could not interpret. Several insectoid creatures that he recognized as chroniclers scuttled forward to examine him more closely, their compound eyes reflecting his image 1,000 times over. They clicked and chirped to each other in a language that sounded like gravel being crushed. The human attempts humor, one of them noted for the official record. This may indicate a coping mechanism for extreme stress. Or it may indicate brain damage, suggested another. Marcus was led through corridors that seemed to go on forever, past windows that looked out on the dying star that the station orbited. The star was a deep, angry red that pulsed with ancient light, and Marcus found himself wondering what kind of species would build their testing facility in such a dramatic location. The Crucible trials have been conducted here for over 40,000 years, explained a floating orb that had attached itself to Marcus as a guide. And every species that has joined the Galactic Concord has proven their worth within these halls. What happens if they fail? Marcus asked. The orb pulsed with an uncomfortable light. That depends on the severity of the failure, it answered. But outcomes have ranged from restricted trade access to complete isolation from galactic society. Marcus swallowed hard and wished he had paid more attention during his briefings. The quarters they assigned him were surprisingly comfortable, with a bed that adjusted to his body shape and a window that looked out on a nebula of swirling purple gas. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that was happening. He was a supply clerk from Wyoming. His greatest accomplishment in life was maintaining a perfect inventory count for 3 consecutive years. He had joined the military because it offered good benefits and a pension, not because he wanted to fight or prove himself. And now the fate of humanity's reputation rested on his unremarkable shoulders. A chime sounded, and the door slid open to reveal a creature that looked like a walking crystal formation. Light refracted through its body in dazzling patterns as it entered the room. "I am Physician Krelser," the creature announced, "and I am here to conduct your pre-trial medical examination." Marcus spent the next 3 hours being scanned and probed and measured by devices he could not understand. The physician made notes on a floating screen, and Marcus noticed that the alien's expression grew more confused with each passing minute. "Your skeletal structure shows signs of repeated stress fractures that have healed over time," Krelser observed, "and your muscle tissue contains far more density than initial scans suggested." "I did basic training like everyone else," Marcus said with a shrug, "and they make us run a lot and carry heavy things." "Your cardiovascular system operates at what would be considered dangerous levels for most species," the physician continued. "And your body contains trace amounts of over 40 toxic compounds that you apparently consume willingly." "Are you talking about coffee?" Marcus asked. The physician stared at him with what might have been horror. "You voluntarily ingest a psychoactive stimulant that would kill most sentient beings?" "Every morning," Marcus confirmed. "Sometimes twice if it has been a rough night." Krelser made several more notes and then departed with visible unease. That evening, Marcus was summoned to a grand dining hall where representatives from dozens of species had gathered to observe him. He was given a seat at the center of a long table, while aliens of every shape and size watched him eat. The food was strange but edible, and Marcus did his best to ignore the cameras that hovered around his head. "Tell us about your training," demanded a creature that resembled a massive slug covered in eyes. "Tell us what humans consider minimum requirements for military service." Marcus thought about the question while chewing something that tasted like chicken mixed with strawberries. "We do physical training every day," he explained. "Running and lifting weights and combat drills. And we learn to shoot weapons and navigate terrain and survive in hostile environments." "For how long?" the slug creature pressed. "Basic training is about 10 weeks, Marcus answered, "and then there is ongoing fitness requirements for as long as you serve." A murmur ran through the assembled aliens. 10 weeks of continuous training would break most species, and the idea of maintaining physical standards for years on end was almost unthinkable. "And you are the weakest product of this system?" asked Velthrix from his position at the head of the table. Marcus considered the question honestly. "I am the least impressive," he admitted, "and I barely pass my fitness tests every year, and I have never been in combat or done anything particularly heroic." "But you still pass," observed a small furry creature with enormous ears, "which means you still meet the standards." "Just barely," Marcus emphasized, "and usually with a lot of complaining." The aliens whispered among themselves, and Marcus caught fragments of conversation about death worlds and evolutionary pressure and survival adaptations. He did not fully understand what they were discussing, but he sensed that something in his answers had disturbed him. That night, as Marcus lay in his strange alien bed and stared at the purple nebula outside his window, he wondered what the next day would bring. The trials would begin at dawn, and he had no idea what he was about to face. He thought about his mother back in Wyoming and his friends at the supply depot and the simple life he had left behind. He thought about the generals who had sent him here and the weight of expectation that now rested on his shoulders. And then Marcus Cole, humanity's weakest soldier, closed his eyes and fell asleep within minutes because tomorrow was going to be a long day and he needed his rest. The watching aliens noted this fact with growing unease because most subjects spent the night before their trial. The first trial began at dawn, and Marcus was led into a chamber that hummed with strange energy. Massive screens lined every wall, and he knew that billions of beings across the galaxy were watching his every move. High Arbiter Velthrix stood on an elevated platform with other observers, their alien eyes fixed upon the small human below. "The trial of strength," Velthrix announced, and his voice boomed through speakers that carried his words to distant stars. "We'll measure the physical power of the human specimen against galactic standards." A machine rose from the floor before Marcus, all gleaming metal and blinking lights. Two handles extended toward him, and he understood that he was meant to grip them and pull with all his might. The machine would measure his output and compare it to the averages of 10,000 other species. "The expected result for a human of your classification is minimal," the floating guide orb explained, "and most observers predict you will register in the lowest percentile." Marcus looked at the machine, and then at the watching aliens, and then back at the machine. He thought about his drill sergeant from basic training, a terrifying woman who had screamed at him for weeks until his body learned to obey commands his mind thought impossible. He gripped the handles and pulled. At first nothing seemed to happen, and Marcus heard clicking sounds from the observers that might have been laughter. But he did not let go, and instead he planted his feet and bent his knees and pulled harder. His face turned red and then purple, and veins stood out on his neck like ropes. A sound escaped his throat that was half scream and half growl, and still he pulled. The machine began to groan. The laughter stopped abruptly as numbers on the display climbed higher and higher. Marcus thought about every time someone had told him he could not do something, every moment he had been dismissed as average or unremarkable, and he channeled all of that frustration into his arms. With a final roar that echoed through the chamber, he gave everything he had. Then his muscles failed and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath while sweat poured down his face. The machine displayed its final reading and the chamber fell into stunned silence. "That cannot be correct," whispered one of the chroniclers. "He has tripled the expected output," confirmed another, "and exceeded the galactic average by 47%. Velthrix stared at the numbers with an expression that Marcus could not read. The High Arbiter's mandibles clicked rapidly, and his four hands clenched and unclenched with obvious agitation. "Proceed to the second trial," he commanded. They gave Marcus 1 hour to recover before the trial of endurance began. He was led to the entrance of a long corridor that stretched into darkness, and the guide orb explained that he must travel 30 kilometers through constantly changing conditions. "Gravity will shift between half and triple Earth normal," the orb said, "and temperatures will range from freezing to extreme heat, and atmospheric composition will vary throughout." "How long do I have?" Marcus asked. 12 hours, though most subjects require multiple days and support teams. Marcus looked into the darkness and sighed. Then he started walking. The first 5 kilometers were almost pleasant, with normal gravity and comfortable temperatures. But then the floor tilted and gravity increased, and each step became a battle against invisible weight pressing down on his body. Marcus bent forward and kept moving, even as his legs burned and his lungs struggled. The cold came next, so intense that his breath formed crystals in the air. His fingers went numb and his teeth chattered, but he wrapped his arms around himself and pushed forward. Then came the heat, so sudden and fierce that he felt like he was walking through fire. His body began to fail at kilometer 15. His legs stopped working properly, and he stumbled and fell to the metal floor. For a long moment, he simply lay there, feeling the cold seep into his bones, wondering if he could just give up. But then he thought about the aliens watching, waiting for him to fail. He thought about humanity and the reputation that rested on his shoulders, and something stubborn ignited in his chest. Marcus began to crawl. His hands scraped against the floor until they bled, and he wrapped the wounds with strips torn from his own shirt. His knees bruised and then tore, leaving red smears on the metal behind him. But he kept moving, inch by inch, meter by meter. The observers watched in horrified fascination. No species had ever completed the endurance trial through crawling, and yet this human refused to stop. His body was clearly broken, his breathing ragged and desperate, but still, he dragged himself forward. 11 hours and 43 minutes after he started, Marcus Cole crossed the finish line and immediately vomited on the pristine alien floor. Impossible, Belthrix breathed. The third trial was pain tolerance, and by now the entire galaxy was watching with undivided attention. Marcus was strapped into a chair and connected to a device that the aliens called a neural inducer, which could simulate any form of pain without causing actual physical damage. This is considered humane by galactic standards, the guide orb explained. That is not reassuring, Marcus replied. The machine activated, and fire exploded through every nerve in his body. It felt like his bones were being slowly extracted through his skin, like every cell was being torn apart and reassembled wrong. Marcus screamed, and his scream echoed through the chamber and out across the watching galaxy. But he did not beg for it to stop. The intensity increased, cycling through different types of agony that no human had ever experienced. Marcus bit through his own lip, and blood ran down his chin. He clenched his jaw so hard that a molar shattered, and still the pain continued. When they finally stopped the machine, Marcus was shaking so badly that he could barely speak. An observer approached and asked how he had endured such torment. Marcus spat blood and fragments of tooth onto the floor and looked up at the towering alien. "I have had worse hangovers," he rasped. Across the galaxy, the laughter and mockery had completely disappeared. In its place, something cold and uncomfortable was growing. Species that had watched the trials as entertainment were now watching with a different emotion. They were watching with fear, and the trials were not yet finished. Marcus was given 1 full day to recover before the 4th trial, and he spent most of that time sleeping in his quarters while medical drones repaired the worst of his injuries. His hands were wrapped in healing gel that regrew skin at an accelerated rate, and his shattered tooth was replaced with a synthetic one that felt strange against his tongue. When he woke, he found a tray of food waiting and a message from High Arbiter Velthrix. "The remaining trials will test your mind," the message said, "and we will see if human intellect matches human stubbornness." Marcus ate his breakfast and tried not to think about what was coming. He had never considered himself particularly smart, and he worried that the mental challenges would expose him as the fraud he felt he was. The 4th trial took place in a chamber that sealed behind him with an ominous hiss. Water immediately began pouring from vents in the ceiling, ice cold and rising fast. Floating before Marcus were 3 complex puzzles made of interlocking shapes and glowing symbols that meant nothing to him. "Solve the puzzles to stop the water," announced a voice from hidden speakers. Marcus grabbed the first puzzle and turned it over in his hands, trying to understand the alien logic. The water reached his ankles and kept climbing. He tried different combinations, pressing symbols and rotating pieces, but nothing worked. The water reached his waist. Panic began to set in as Marcus realized he could not solve these puzzles. They were designed by minds completely unlike his own, using logic systems that humanity had never encountered. He was going to drown in this chamber while the galaxy watched and laughed. The water reached his chest. And then something shifted in Marcus Cole's mind. He stopped trying to solve the puzzles and started looking at them differently. These were obstacles that stood between him and survival, and if he could not go through them, he would go around them. He smashed the first puzzle against the wall. The observers gasped as the human destroyed the carefully crafted device, tearing it apart with his bare hands. But Marcus was not interested in their shock, because he had noticed something important. The puzzle contained mechanical components, and those components could be useful. The water reached his neck. Marcus dove under the surface and swam to the wall where the main water intake valve was visible. He jammed the broken puzzle pieces into the mechanism, forcing gears and springs into places they were never meant to go. The valve groaned and shuddered and then stopped completely. The water began to drain. Marcus surfaced and gasped for air while the chamber slowly emptied around him. He had not solved the puzzles in the way the trial intended, but he had stopped the water and survived. The observers erupted in protest. "This is not how the trial works," shouted one of the chroniclers. "He has violated the spirit of the test," agreed another. But Velthrix raised a hand for silence, and his expression was troubled. "The rules stated only that the subject must stop the water," he said slowly, "and they did not specify how this must be accomplished." The trial was ruled a success, though many observers lodged formal complaints. Marcus was taken back to his quarters while the Concord debated what they had witnessed. "Humans do not solve problems," observed Counselor Nemther during the deliberations. "They remove problems entirely, and they do so with violence if necessary." "This is deeply concerning," agreed Ambassador Krillvex. The fifth and final trial was called The Breaking, and it was designed to find the fracture point in any mind. Marcus was led into a chamber of absolute darkness and strapped into a chair that held him completely immobile. Devices attached to his head could read his thoughts and memories and fears. "The psychological assessment will continue until you break," explained the guide orb, "and the average duration is 6 hours before complete mental collapse." Then the orb departed, and Marcus was alone in the darkness. The machine activated and began pulling memories from his mind. He saw his father walking out the door when Marcus was 7 years old, and he felt the abandonment fresh and raw as if it had just happened. He saw his first girlfriend leaving him for someone more impressive, and he felt the inadequacy wash over him. He saw every failure and every mistake and every moment of shame from his entire life. The memories played on loop while sensory deprivation stripped away his connection to reality. Marcus lost track of time completely, and he began to wonder if he had ever existed outside this chair. If his whole life had been a dream, and this darkness was all there truly was. Fear amplification kicked in, and his worst terrors manifested around him. He saw monsters from childhood nightmares and felt the certainty that he was dying alone and forgotten. He experienced the sensation of falling forever and the horror of being buried alive. Hours passed, or perhaps days, because time had no meaning in the darkness. But Marcus Cole did not break. He did not break because he had already faced everything the machine could show him. He had lived with failure his entire life, and woken up every morning knowing he was unremarkable and average and destined for nothing special. The fears the machine showed him were fears he had already conquered simply by continuing to exist. "You think this darkness is your weapon?" Marcus whispered to the void. "I was born in darkness like this, in the quiet despair of ordinary life, and I have survived it every single day." 19 hours after the trial began, the chamber doors finally opened. Medical teams rushed in, expecting to find a shattered mind weeping in the corner. Instead, they found Marcus Cole doing push-ups. His eyes were hollow and his hands shook with exhaustion. But when Velthrix demanded to know how he had resisted, Marcus rose on unsteady legs and faced the towering alien. "You showed me my worst memories," he said, and his voice was rough and broken. "My failures and my fears and my darkest moments." He laughed, a terrible sound that held no humor. "But I live with those every single day. You did not show me anything I have not already survived." The chamber fell completely silent as the weight of his words settled over the observers. Somewhere across the galaxy, a species that had never known war began to understand why humanity had never lost one. They had found warriors who could not be broken because they were already intimately familiar with their own darkness and had chosen to keep fighting anyway. And that was more terrifying than any physical strength could ever be. The trials were over, and Marcus Cole was taken to a medical facility, where alien doctors worked for 3 days to repair the damage to his body and mind. His hands needed new skin, his muscles needed regeneration therapy, and his psychological profile required careful monitoring to ensure no permanent harm had been done. But through it all, the unremarkable human from Wyoming remained conscious and cooperative and even attempted small jokes that the medical staff did not understand. "Is there any way to get coffee on this station?" he asked the physician Krauser during one examination. "We have removed that substance from your system as a toxin," the physician replied, "and we strongly recommend you never consume it again." "Then I am going to die," Marcus said seriously, "because coffee is the only thing keeping me alive." The physician could not determine if the human was joking. Meanwhile, the Concord of United Species had descended into chaos. The footage from the trials had spread across every network and every world, and billions of beings who had tuned in expecting entertainment had instead witnessed something that shook them to their core. High Arbiter Velthrix stood before the Grand Assembly and delivered his report with visible reluctance. "The human subject exceeded all expectations in every trial," he said, and his 4 hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "And his performance would have been remarkable for any species, but becomes extraordinary when we remember that he represents the minimum standard of human capability." "Surely there must be some mistake," protested Ambassador Krillvex, "and perhaps the humans deceived us about his status." "We verified his records through 17 independent sources," Velthrix replied. "And he is exactly what they claimed, a logistics clerk with no combat experience, and fitness scores at the bare minimum for active service." The assembly fell silent as the implications sank in. If this broken, gasping, bleeding creature was truly humanity's weakest soldier, what did that say about their strongest? What monsters had evolution forged on that terrible death world? "I must issue a formal recommendation," Velthrix continued, and his voice was heavy with reluctant respect, "that under no circumstances should the Concord engage in any form of conflict with humanity." "Are you suggesting we fear them?" demanded a warrior representative from the Dominion clans. "I am stating a fact," Velthrix answered, "that their weakest soldier outperformed our strongest expectations, and their average is our exceptional. If this is their floor, we must never discover their ceiling." The vote was unanimous. Humanity was granted full diplomatic status, complete trade rights, and a permanent seat on the Concord Council. The decision was not made out of respect or admiration. It was made out of pure and simple fear. Marcus Cole remained on the station for 2 more weeks while his body healed and diplomats arranged his transport home. During that time, he became something of a celebrity, though he did not want or enjoy the attention. Aliens approached him constantly to ask questions about humanity, and he answered as honestly as he could. They wanted to know about Earth and its dangers, about human training and human culture, about the strange species that had crawled out of a death world and conquered the stars. How do you keep fighting when your body fails? Asked the young alien warrior who had watched the endurance trial. Marcus thought about the question for a long moment. Because giving up hurts more than continuing, he finally said. And because somewhere behind me there are people counting on me to finish. The warrior considered this answer and then bowed deeply, a gesture of respect that Marcus later learned was reserved only for the greatest heroes of their species. When the transport ship finally carried him back to Earth, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not realized he was carrying. The familiar blue marble grew larger in the view screen, and he thought about his apartment and his job and his ordinary life waiting for him below. He was met at the landing site by General Chun and a small delegation of military officials. They pinned a medal on his chest in a private ceremony, a medal that was classified at the highest levels and would never appear in any public record. You have done humanity a greater service than you can possibly know, General Chun told him, and the galaxy will remember what you showed them. Marcus looked at the medal and then at the general. Can I go home now? He asked. They promoted him quietly, increasing his pay and reducing his responsibilities. They assigned him to a comfortable desk job where he would never have to take another fitness test, and they let him return to the life he had known before. But the galaxy did not forget. On 10,000 worlds, military academies began redesigning their training programs. If humanity's minimum was so much higher than expected, then clearly the standards needed to change. Soldiers trained harder and pushed further, trying to match what an unremarkable human had demonstrated. On ships and stations across the stars, the footage of Marcus Cole's trials was studied and analyzed and discussed. They watched him crawl through the endurance corridor and endure impossible pain and survive 19 hours of psychological torture. They watched and they learned and they feared. And in the quiet halls of power, species that had once dismissed humanity as newcomers began treating them with careful respect. Diplomatic insults were smoothed over, trade disputes were resolved in humanity's favor, and territorial claims were withdrawn without explanation. Because everyone remembered what the weakest human soldier had done. In his small apartment in Wyoming, Marcus Cole microwaved a frozen dinner and settled onto his couch to watch terrible television. His medal was in a drawer somewhere, and his memories of the trials were slowly fading into something he could almost forget. He was nobody special, just an ordinary man with flat feet and mild asthma, who had somehow become a legend without meaning to. The galaxy considered him a hero, but he still had to pay his bills and do his laundry and show up to work on time. That was the truth the aliens would never fully understand. Humanity was not special because of their heroes or their champions or their greatest warriors. They were special because even their weakest could become something extraordinary when pushed hard enough. And if Marcus Cole could endure the crucible trials, if a supply clerk from Wyoming could make the galaxy tremble in fear, then what would happen if humanity ever truly went to war? The answer was something the Concord hoped never to discover. And so they treated humanity with respect, and they watched the stars with careful eyes. And they remembered forever the lesson taught by an ordinary man who refused to break. The galaxy had tested humanity's weakest soldier, and they would never stop regretting what they learned.